Just waiting for Robert, then I'll get started. So happy Wednesday evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Chuck Smith. I'm the CEO of Equality Texas. And very grateful that you've taken time out from your busy week and your busy schedule to join us here for our third Masterpiece Town Hall. We have several of our panelists are road warriors this week. We started in Dallas. We were in Waco last night. And tomorrow night we'll conclude in Houston, but I'm very grateful that each of you have joined us here this evening. And so you might be wondering, why does any of this matter? So unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably seen that almost every day there's something in the news that's of interest and part of some sort of attack, either against the LGBT community or against the larger civil rights of the American population. So with the recent ruling in the Masterpiece Cakeshop case by the United States Supreme Court, plus recent changes in the actual makeup of the court, given Justice Kennedy's retirement, things are happening that are a very real threat to the civil rights of the American people. And so this evening, we want to spend some time to talk about both the Masterpiece Cake decision, as well as what might be happening at the United States Supreme Court with its makeup. Certainly with a focus on LGBTQ issues, but also discussing how this is broader than just LGBTQ and its impact on the larger civil rights, or structure of civil rights protections in our country. In terms of our roadmap today, we're going to have a discussion with our subject matter experts here on the panel. We'll also have plenty of time for feedback and conversation and Q&A with members of the audience. And then I'm not going to let you leave here with us without us asking you to take some actions for ways that you can help in real time as we move forward. I'd like to introduce our panel of participants. Eric Rothschild joined the Americans United for Separation of Church and State in 2016 as their senior litigation counsel at Americans United. He's litigated a federal court claim on behalf of a lesbian couple that was harassed and disparaged by a courthouse official when they applied for their marriage license. He sued the Trump administration to stop the Muslim ban, represented parents suing public schools for religious instruction and prayer at school events. Before joining AU, he was a partner with the law firm of Pepper Hamilton in Philadelphia, where he served as lead counsel in partnership with Americans United and the ACLU in Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District, the federal court case that established that teaching intelligent design creationism in public schools is unconstitutional. Rebecca Robertson is the Chief Program Officer of Equality Texas. As a lawyer, she's been working for equality for LGBTQ people for her entire career. From setting up free will clinics during the darkest days of the AIDS scourge in the 1990s, to helping the transgender community defeat the bathroom bill in the last legislative session. When she was a partner at Baker Botts, she led the firm's amicus team on the landmark Lawrence v. Texas case, which struck down the state of Texas's sodomy law. At Equality Texas, she leads a team of fierce LGBTQ advocates fighting to achieve full legal and lived equality in the state of Texas. And I have the pleasure of working with her every day. Maria Salazar, who uses she, her pronouns, identifies as a Chicana genderqueer lesbiana with a propensity to wear fabulous bow ties. As you can see, she's doing so here this evening. She is a family law attorney in private practice in San Antonio. For over 10 years, she represented children and parents of child abuse and neglect docket. Currently, she serves as president for Orgullo de San Antonio, LGBT LULAC Council 22198, and was recently appointed to serve on the LGBTQ plus advisory committee by San Antonio's Mayor Ron Nierenberg. Maria has a long history of working for civil rights organizations, including the Sylvia Rivera Law Project and the Empire State Pride Agenda in New York, the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center in San Antonio, and Equal Rights Advocates in San Francisco. She graduated from City University, New York School of Law. Welcome. Robert Salcido is the statewide field coordinator at Equality Texas. He is a social justice advocate and activist at the local, state, and national level. He has extensive experience working with issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, LGBTQ plus education, and non-discrimination. Locally, he also serves as the volunteer executive director and board chair for the Pride Center San Antonio. I also have the pleasure of working with Robert every day. So let's dive right in. Let's talk a little bit about the Masterpiece case briefly. There's been a lot in the news about its relevance to the LGBT community, and it's an important decision. What exactly happened in this case?
So first of all, can you all hear me if I talk without a microphone?
Mm-hmm.
Yes? I have a big mouth, so I think it's probably good. Okay, it's easier than passing the mic back and forth. So, I want to start by talking about what happened to the couple in the case. I think we've all heard a lot about the baker. He's the one who's getting all the headlines. He has a good publicist, I guess. But maybe you've heard a little bit less about Dave Mullins and Charlie Craig. They are a couple who live in Denver, Colorado. And in 2011, they were planning to get married. At that time, you could not legally marry in Colorado, and so they made plans to go to Provincetown, Massachusetts, where they could get married legally. And when they came home, they wanted to have a party for their family and friends to celebrate this new chapter in their lives. And so they started doing what you do when you're planning to get married to the person that you love. They had a notebook and they started collecting ideas for the party and making the guest list and thinking about how they were going to have this celebration. One of the things that you do is you buy a cake for your guests, and their wedding planner suggested a place near the venue where they were going to have the party, the Masterpiece Cakeshop. And Charlie's mom, Deb, came down from Wyoming to help him out, because who doesn't want to help pick out the cake and maybe do some tastings? So they got their book and Deb, and they went off to the Masterpiece Cakeshop to make a decision about the cake for their party. And they walked in and they talked to Mr. Phillips, Jack Phillips, who's the owner of the Masterpiece Cakeshop. And they said, "We're here to talk to somebody about a wedding cake." And he said, "Who is the cake for?" And they said, "Well, it's for us. That's why we're here." And he said, "I don't bake cakes for same-sex weddings." They didn't really know what to do. Just got Deb the book and had to leave without having really discussed any of their ideas about what their event would be like. And I read an interview with Charlie a little while before the Supreme Court argument, where he was kind of reflecting on what it was like in the days after they were turned away at the Masterpiece Cakeshop. And he said, "I grew up in Wyoming at a time when Matthew Shepard was beaten and hung from a fence post to die in the night alone. And I moved to the big city. I moved to Denver, Colorado, because I thought I was going to be safe there. I thought it was going to be different and that I could be who I am without fear. And I got there to the cake shop and had this experience and realized that, my idea of what my life was going to be like in Denver was really wrong. And it was very upsetting to us. So I often say that if Charlie and Dave lived here in many parts of Texas, that would be the end of their story. But they lived in Colorado, which for years has had on the books a civil rights statute that prohibits discrimination by businesses who open their doors to the public. And the law just says that if you're open to the public, then you have to serve everybody on the same basis, without regard to their race or their sex, their sexual orientation. You can't turn people away because of who they are. And so Dave and Charlie were able to file a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. And that's how we ended up with this case at the U.S. Supreme Court.
Eric, can you talk about how did the Supreme Court rule? What did they hold?
Yeah, to answer that question, you have to understand what the Baker argued to get out of the application of this very broad Colorado anti-discrimination law. He said, well, I have a sincere religious belief that does not I do not believe in marriage between same-sex couples, and I have a free exercise of religion under the United States Constitution, or basis to be exempted from this law in this case, and I have a free speech right because what I do when I make cakes, particularly custom-made wedding cakes, is artistic. It is expression by me. So I should, for that reason, also the baker should have constitutional protection that overrides Charlie and David's rights under this anti-discrimination law. And if he had won on either of those bases, then really the civil rights laws that protected Charlie and David and all Coloradans would have been severely curtailed. Because it would mean that anybody claiming a religious belief or who could make a plausible claim that the product they made and sold was expression would be able to get out of complying with this important Colorado civil rights law. But the court said we can't rule, any ruling for the baker would have to be sufficiently constrained that they could not say that, put out a sign and say that the goods and services we sell here are not available to gay people, or not available for gay marriages. And they did that. The court did rule much more narrowly. They did rule for the baker, but they did it for a reason that was somewhat legally problematic and very unique to this case and idiosyncratic. They said what happened to the baker, not in his interaction with Charlie and David, but when he went through the Civil Rights Commission proceedings, was unfair to him because a couple of the Colorado Civil Rights Commissioners who heard his case, and particularly one, said things that were disparaging of the baker's religious beliefs. They said, that religion has, or this one commissioner said that when religion has been used to justify things like slavery and the Holocaust, and that using religion to hurt other people is the most despicable kind of rhetoric. And the court concluded, and 7 justices, including some of the liberal justices, said that treatment of the baker's claim meant that he did not get a fair proceeding. And on that narrow basis, they ruled for the baker.
So is it accurate to say it was a win for the baker?
After the decision, the baker and his lawyer from an organization called the Alliance Defending Freedom, which brings claims and defends people just like this baker, were thrilled. So I think they feel like they won, and they should feel like they won because they got a Supreme Court ruling in their favor, and this particular decision against the baker was vacated. The requirement that he keep a record of anybody he turned away, and all this, and communicate that he would serve everybody fairly. Those things were vacated. So I think it's fair to say that he won the case. I think it's also worth noting that in this Supreme Court case, the injury that Charlie and David experienced and their rights were completely forgotten. They are mentioned in the Supreme Court opinion, but it very quickly becomes a discussion of what happened in the proceeding, and it's really the baker versus the Civil Rights Commission, and the reason the dispute started in the first place and the people who were injured in the first place are completely forgotten. So for them, that's a real loss. But in terms of what this ruling means on its face for this particular baker, Jack Phillips, in the future, and other public businesses in Colorado, I would say it was not a license to discriminate. That if at another baker or florist, Charlie and David, I hope they don't have to get married again, but if they came in for an anniversary celebration of their marriage, there would be no basis for those vendors to discriminate against them, and really it was only a function of the particular way the commission handled this particular case in a way that the justices determined was unfair to the baker and offended their sensibilities.
How is this case resonating in the Latinx community? Are people seeing themselves now as being the potential targets of discrimination?
Well, I think there's in the Latinx community, there's you can't talk about these issues without bringing in intersectionality, and so there's other issues that compound just existing as a brown person, as a queer person in the world. There's immigration issues, and so I think my sense of this from the community is we've made these strides in acceptance, not just as queers, but also as Latinos, and now there's like this kind of a pause, like, well, wait a minute, there might not be acceptance. There's this trajectory of being included, being recognized and seen as equal from your sexual orientation, from your cultura, from your race, from your ethnicity, and so I think there's a chilling effect on how out to be or how empowered to be, because I think my sense, the feedback I get from people is like, well, should we get married now? Should we write a will? And this is across the board, but because if you look at the Latino community, it's very varied. We have and it impacts other areas in family law, and that's the area I practice, probate law, and so they're looking at, okay, if I want to adopt my niece or I want a guardianship issue, and this noise is out there about this a license to discriminate, and there's some confusion about that, then there's like this apprehension about what needs to be done to protect the gains that we made. And I mentioned intersectionality because it was like, well, okay, I can marry my partner, but can I enter into a contract just on a day-to-day basis and not worry about being discriminated? And is it about my sexual orientation? Or is it about my race? Or is it about my ethnicity? Or what's that about? I think that's kind of the reaction that I hear from the community and in my practice.
How about you, Robert?
I would certainly agree. I think Maria hit on a very important concept there, is the intersectionality of us here in San Antonio. I think when I talk to friends and to people that are in the community, when we think about the Masterpiece Cake, there's several people, and I'll give an example. I was just in the Valley a couple of weekends ago for their Pride celebration, and a couple of people brought up the concept of it's just a cake. But when we look at it that way, it's far more than just a cake. We're talking about discrimination against individuals simply because of who they are, whom they love. But we also think about how that concept itself of thinking about it's just a cake is that I think because they're not putting it on the same level of importance of other issues that we see in the community. We can rattle off to name a few. We can talk about the immigration issues that are happening right now and families being detained and separated from one another. We can talk about the fight against women having control over their own bodies. We can talk about many different issues that are happening that are, I don't want to say less important, but they feel that they have a bigger impact to the Latino or Latinx community. And so that's what I kind of see when I'm talking to people as I travel throughout South Texas, is that it's just really another thing that's added to the list of all the horrible things that are happening that have sometimes a greater impact against the Latino community. And I can't disagree with them because I certainly understand where they're coming from. If we, as Chuck said earlier, if we turn on the news and we watch a newscast, not only are we going to hear about the discrimination or the rhetoric that's happening that is negatively impacting our communities, Here in Texas, I mean, just recently, and it's still going on, about teaching the correct Mexican-American studies in our classrooms. So that, education is another level that we look at. And not about what we're even teaching in the classroom, but even the fight about what to call what we're going to teach in the classroom. Because there's that issue of Mexican-American, why are you going to put Mexican in front of American? And, really it's a bunch of nonsense. And at the core of it, these are all things that our community, or my community, see that are negatively impacting them. So again, not to say that one is more or less important than the other, but I think there's just so many things that are happening right now that affect our communities that it's hard to kind of differentiate what means what and how is it going to affect me directly in my everyday life.
Maria, you work in family law. Can you talk a little bit about how would that impact you and your work, and specifically how would that impact your clients if foster care agencies take it upon themselves to have a license to discriminate, and perhaps even more importantly, what if judges do the same thing?
Well, I think what we risk is having a checkered system of justice. If we look at the issue of licensing, and right now, a licensing agency can, not license a family because of their sexual orientation or because of their status as a single person. Fortunately, in Bexar County, we're a lot, in San Antonio, we have a lot of different agencies, so there's opportunities. But you go to North Texas, you go to Texarkana, you go to north of Houston, or you go to the Panhandle, where there's only maybe a handful of licensing agencies, and a lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual person is going to have limited resources. They're not going to have that licensing, we'd be able to go get licensed to take in a foster child. So you end up like, well, maybe if I move to San Antonio or to Dallas, I might be able to create the family that I want. But that's not fair, and that's a checkered system. So you can pursue your livelihood, in this area, but you might want to have a second thought about establishing a home in Fort Stockton. And it's the same thing with, and that's just a licensing agency. And then you look at the state agency itself that does licensing. And so, they have relationships within the judicial system. So is the state licensing, adoption facility in Texarkana, and I keep mentioning that because I was there a couple, last year I was visiting kids, and I was, that's where all the Ted Cruz supporters are, and that's where you see and it makes you realize made me realize, wow, Texas is a big state, and it made me think like, wow, is a caseworker in this region going to be able to help a same-sex couple get licensed to take in a family? And the need is so great, and I don't know. So how does these kinds of pieces of legislation impact our community? It's arresting, period. And then we're kind of, I don't want to say they're backdoor channels, but it's like you really have to know the agencies that are willing to advocate for LGBTQIA communities. I'll add one other thing. In my experience as a family law attorney, a lot of times we have children that can go to a family member, and that family member may be the crazy lovely aunt that happens to be a lesbian, or it might be the gay uncle, right? And in Bexar County, here, and in Travis County, Austin, the focus is on what's best for the child. But even that's not exactly a safety net, because when I started practicing 10 years ago, there was a judge in Houston that refused to place a child, regardless of whether or not they were a relative or related to this child, in a same-sex house. And so so it's like, well, how do we get around meeting the best interest of that child? And so that's like kind of insider knowledge, and that's just not fair. the law should apply equally to all people, especially when it comes to creating our families and creating our livelihoods and moving forward. So it's a chilling effect. I can go on about how I think it affects our youth, but we end up with a checkered system, and that's what we can't have that, because it's just not fair.
So I'll admit that sometimes I watch Fox News, not because it's fair and balanced, but because I like to watch and see what opponents of equality are saying. And if you watched Fox News after the Masterpiece decision came out, you would hear people saying that it was a landmark win for opponents of equality. Are they wrong?
They are wrong, but there's a reason that they are describing it that way. I think Eric described it perfectly when he said it was a very narrow win for the baker on very idiosyncratic grounds, but it should not be interpreted as poking a hole in our civil rights laws. But the folks on the other side portray it differently and have really lifted up that baker as an example to the world because they have an agenda. And that agenda, this organization that Eric was talking about, Alliance Defending Freedom, is bringing these cases all over the country and is putting Mr. Phillips out there as a hero of religious liberty to encourage more people to think that it's okay to discriminate against people based on your own personal religious beliefs. To normalize that in our culture so that people feel like, well, of course you're able to carve out services to lesbian, gay, transgender people if you don't like them. Of course you can do that because we just call that religious liberty. That's just how our nation was founded. It's a really aggressive program to reshape what we think religious liberty means and to create this constitutional right to discriminate that is not how we have traditionally interpreted our First Amendment. And then the other piece of it, of course, is to make any kind of commerce that has an expressive component suddenly be a free speech battleground. So that, and if you think about the kind of business that you do every day in your job, in your transactions out in the world, think about how many of those you could argue have some sort of expressive content. And now that would be a battleground where you could argue that you could pick and choose which laws to follow because the First Amendment gives you that right. So they want to use Mr. Phillips as the poster person for this agenda, and that's why they are crowing about the outcome.
Yeah, I think what you said about redefining religious liberty is really important because we do have, and we should have, a really strong sense of religious liberty where this church can practice the way it wants to, and people have an incredible right to religious freedom. What is happening in these religious refusal cases is that strong religious believers, and we don't, no reason to doubt that, are saying, well, we get to take our religious beliefs so far that it overcomes laws and rights that have been created for everybody. It could be the best interest of the children standard, right? That's supposed to be controlling, and it's going to be overcome. Or it could be the right to go to a public place of business and have the same treatment in that business as anybody else. It could be in the criminal law system that they're saying, well, our religion gives us an exception from it. And that's, when we have these laws that are meant to protect everybody, that's the point where, religious liberty, just like any other liberty, can't be treated as an exception that gets people out of that out of the laws that we're all abiding by. When other business, if somebody runs a business and is not keen on a particular religious group, that doesn't mean that they get to say, well, we're going to turn you away, and that should be the same for everybody.
Maria, have you seen this strategy used before in terms of chipping away?
Yeah. Look at the abortion, the reproductive rights. That decision, a woman has a right to make a decision on what happens to their body. And that's what, and so the strategy for the right has been to chip away at that. And what does that mean? Well, we start placing limitations. Well, you can only have an abortion at this stage. Well, you need to go through this process before you make this decision. Well, you need to have this assessment, this interview with your doctor, so you understand what it means to make this choice and what the health risks are. That's what we call chipping away. And so when it comes to, you know, these kinds of decisions, then I think that the strategy, because the advancement of, you know, marriage equality, being able to marry who we love, I am guessing that there's going to be a chipping away procedure. What does that mean? Well, one big question right now is like, what does it mean when you get married? Do you automatically get conferred all the rights that the institution of marriage gives you? And you can go through different states, and every state confers all these rights to a married couple. Inheritance, the right to sue in a wrongful death case, the right to inherit, to get an alcohol license when your partner dies, okay? So now, you know, the chance of, well, this, you know, if your same-sex partner passes away, do you get that license that's been in the family for 50 years? Well, the question should be yes, but that's what made the chipping away. Or maybe even it's, you know, maybe placing different restrictions on even asking for that marriage license, you know. Like, I'll give you an example. I was sharing that, you know, in Bear County, you get your marriage license, right, and you have to wait 3 days, right? And that's for everybody before you can get actually married. So, you know, think creatively. If you don't want people to, you know what, we're going to make you wait 90 days. You same-sex, you know, same-sex couple. It's not, it sounds ludicrous, but that's what I mean about chipping away. Challenging, well, let's redefine what marriage means and what is inherent when you marry your partner.
Can I just follow up on something that she said, because I think it's such a good comparison. You know, one of the things that's happening in the movement to overturn Roe v. Wade is to try to change Americans' hearts and minds about abortion and to convince people of a certain narrative about abortion. And that chipping away strategy is selected, the mechanisms that they choose are often selected to win that hearts and minds battle. Like a lot of those regulations are about health and safety, even though they don't confer any health and safety benefits to women. And we're seeing very much the same thing in the fight for LGBTQ equality. You know, the marriage decisions were not just legal victories, they were hearts and minds victories. After Americans met Edie Windsor and heard about her 45-year love affair with Fayez Fire, after they met Jim Obergefell and learned how he cared so lovingly for his husband John Arthur as he died of Lou Gehrig's disease, you know, people realized love is love. And we have never had more acceptance by Americans for same-sex couples and for, you know, their LGBT at least neighbors. We have a different conversation about the T, I think, but for their LGBT neighbors. And so part of the reason that you are seeing so much about Jack Phillips is because Americans also really care about religious liberty, and they're trying to win the battle for hearts and minds again. They're trying to shift that progress about how people feel about us.
So notwithstanding Americans defending freedom crowing about this on Fox News that it's such a big win, is that, are they done? Is that, or is this the tip of the iceberg?
I mean, just in the, I'll call it the marriage services arena, there are about, you know, close to a dozen cases going through the courts at various levels, and I'm sure there will be more examples of this involving florists, videographers, invitation companies, and the like. We will see now what will happen in the wake of Masterpiece and a likely change in the Supreme Court, whether Masterpiece will be constrained to its terms, a very unusual and idiosyncratic decision that doesn't seem to have more application, or whether the religious liberty argument that these vendors are making will get a stronger foothold. There has been one decision after Masterpiece in an Arizona court for an invitation company, and there the court looked at Masterpiece and said, they're talking about a very specific situation where the people deciding, where the commission deciding the case didn't give a fair hearing to the baker. We don't have that problem here. Everything's been fair, so we're going to affirm our prior decision that invitation company cannot discriminate against same-sex couples in their public business. And we will see what happens in remaining cases.
So what does all this mean right now for the LGBT community? What is the status of non-discrimination protections in the wake of the Masterpiece decision?
I'll touch about, you know, so there, you know, the Masterpiece decision it seems like where things kind of went awry was in the enforcement process, right? And in San Antonio, that's what we're trying to figure out. I mean, we're trying to figure out what is the enforcement mechanism? How can it be given teeth? And the other issue is like, how do we get this information out to the community about the non-discrimination ordinance in San Antonio? And I think we have to be very careful when we're looking at enforcement so that we guide the grievance along and keep focus on the grievance of the person who's been discriminated. And I think that's going to involve a lot of education when we look at the enforcement, because it's like, ooh, okay, that's where it turned, because then all of a sudden, what are we talking? Who's the victim and who's losing out? And so, I think in San Antonio, we need to really look at the enforcement mechanism. How are these grievances being evaluated? How are they being measured? And what's the outcome of that? Because, quite frankly, I can't tell you. I can't, what's the clarification on that? And then I can't tell you, well, I can tell you what discrimination is for the non-discrimination ordinance and what it covers in San Antonio. And what resources are available, but I can't tell you, okay, what's the phone number? Who's the equity officer over at City Hall? I've been out for 30 years, and we were just had a discussion about this at the mayor's advisory committee. How do we get that information out to our community? And I was thinking, when I was growing up as a little Chicana lesbian, which I could go to the bars and there was a pamphlet there on where I could go get health services. I could go to the bar, and there was a newsletter on where I can get support coming out as a young Chicana lesbiana. And so I was thinking about that, is that available for the community here? And and how do we dialogue within our own communities about being treated equally and what's available to them?
So San Antonio has a non-discrimination ordinance.
Yes.
And it includes public accommodations.
Yes.
So would you contend if a baker refused to work with someone here, they would be in violation of the City of San Antonio's non-discrimination ordinance?
I think they would be.
So, yes, it would be in violation. So the ordinance that was updated in 2013 included, or to add on, sexual orientation and gender identity to the existing clause, which basically for public accommodations is for any business here in our community. However, when we talk about the strength of our ordinance or the teeth that are within the ordinance, that is not going to prevent somebody from doing it. Because quite simply, frankly, if somebody complains against, we'll use the baker since that's what we're talking about, a bakery not baking a cake for them, and if it does happen to go through that entire process and they are found to be in violation of our ordinance, they're slapped on the hand with a $500 fine, and it's a municipal violation.
It's a ticket.
It's a ticket. I mean, I've had speeding tickets that are higher than that.
Damn.
And I will say that it has not prevented me from speeding more. I still speed. And why I say that is because just because they get a $500 fine, in some instances, a business is willing to incur a $500 municipal fine with no other repercussions or backlash, because it's just, that's a fine, I'll pay it. It's not any type of, real penalty, if you will. I think what also, just real quick to add on to that though, is that, as I mentioned, that's if that claim were to go through the entire system. But going back to what Maria said, where there processes in place. Yes, we have an equity office, but is that the equity office who actually handles the case from start, or the complaint from start to finish? No. There's actually not a really great process on that. When we talk about public accommodations, if somebody in San Antonio were to put a complaint against a particular business or establishment, that complaint, as it sits right now, goes to SAPD for investigation. Is that the right agency to doing it? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. But what I'm trying to say is that sometimes it falls within the cracks. The few that have been complaints that have gone through that I'm aware of, have gone to SAPD for investigation, have not been investigated properly, for whatever reasons, and then it falls to the wayside. And nothing's ever been done about it. So it's never even been able to get to that step of penalizing or slapping the hand of the violator. So there's other things, just speaking locally in our own community, it's patchwork. I think what we need to do as a community, it would be great to have something on a federal level, but it would even be, it's talking on the local perspective, it would be better to have fully comprehensive non-discrimination laws in place for the state that's not just patchwork on here in our local community by an ordinance that could really, in our next legislative session, be really wiped away because of preemption laws. And so there's a lot of things and nuances that go into it, but really at the end of the day, we're not protected.
I totally agree, Robert, that what you are saying points up the need. I think Maria's point too points up the need for something to happen on a statewide level, because we don't have that right now. But I would also really encourage people, if something like this happens to you, still make a report. Even though the ordinance may be inadequate to really meet your needs, and it may not give you a remedy, it's really important for us as a community to make a record when these things happen. So if you're a veteran and this happens to you, if you're a person of color and this happens to you, if you're LGBTQ and this happens, please make a report. Even if it isn't perfect, use what we have.
So can we talk a little bit about what should people do if they're discriminated against?
I guess I just said
Well,
mine.
you said part of it. Yeah.
So if somebody is discriminated, and I'm going to speak kind of more broadly than just the reporting, but I think it's important that we continue to advocate as community members and as citizens of our state and of the U.S. to say that we need these fully comprehensive laws on the books so that we don't have to have the patchwork that's out there for one city and not out there for another city. It might be out there for somebody that lives in a city versus the rural area. We have to keep advocating, keep pushing forward with it, contacting our legislative bodies, whether it's our municipal level, state level. That's really the only way that we're going to be able to move forward, is by keep letting people not really forget about what needs to be done. I think also, and that's more on a personal level, individually what we can do, but then we can also think about what can a business do. Are we part of a business where we are a decision maker, or are we the owner of a business? There's a coalition out there, Texas Competes, where you can sign on and say that as a business you advocate for the equal treatment of LGBTQ folks because it creates an economic impact to our state. Aside from the fact that it's the right thing to do. So from that case, from a religious standpoint or from a faith perspective, we have Texas Believes. For communities and congregations to sign on to, saying, as a church, we are affirming and we, believe that everybody should be respected. We believe that God loves everybody for who they are, and and affirm them. So there's different ways that we can advocate for our own communities, and different perspectives. So individually, business, faith. No matter which kind of avenue you turn down, there's a way for us to advocate, and I couldn't, stress that enough. We got to keep our voices out there.
And then don't forget the lawyers.
How could I? I'm sitting with three.
So you have local lawyers like Maria. You have organizations like mine who is eager to joust with organizations like the Alliance Defense Fund over issues like this. We started an initiative a few years ago called Protect Thy Neighbor, which is directed at exactly this religious refusal issue, both in terms of advocacy and litigation, and we have brought cases on behalf of gay couples on this very issue of weddings. So we're there for you. You have great organizations like Lambda Legal Defense Fund, which is bringing a case right now on behalf of a couple who was turned away from being able to foster a child because the placement agency made a religious refusal. You have the ACLU as a national organization, and in Texas. So, reach out to us. Bringing a lawsuit is a hard thing. It's understandably can be a scary thing, but talk to us because we can talk together about whether, we can bring a case on your behalf. Often you can bring cases as a doe, meaning your identity is kept secret. So, there are lawyers that Rebecca described, Alliance Defending Freedom, who have an agenda to cut into rights. We and our peer organizations are the ones there to stand up for your rights.
So is it just wedding-related services that we need to worry about?
The answer is clearly no. I said earlier that Alliance Defending Freedom and organizations like it have an agenda that they are advancing. And, you know, we have some examples really very recently where these religious refusals are growing beyond wedding-related services. An example that came to my attention just recently happened in South Carolina, where a woman moved to South Carolina from Florida. She had 10 years of experience as a foster parent, and she wanted to get involved mentoring foster kids in her new home. And she went through the process with this religiously affiliated agency, which uses taxpayer dollars to train foster volunteers and to do placements and things like that. And she was turned away because they only want to serve Christians, and she's Jewish. And so even though she's experienced and she's there ready to participate to make kids' lives better, she was turned away because she's Jewish. And the governor of South Carolina scrambled to issue an executive order in their state because that's actually currently not legal to do with taxpayer money. So he hurried up and did an executive order that gave this agency an opt-out. And now we have a federal fight about to happen over the very same issue with federal tax dollars. So it is not just wedding-related services.
There are Texas and a growing number of states have laws allowing religious refusals in the adoption foster care placement agencies. And, you know, first of all, you know, we think that is, and those religious refusals could apply to who can become the adoptive or foster placement agency. It could affect the children that they who they take under their custody and how they treat them. And I mean, we think this is a pretty tragic development because there are so many kids, there are way more kids who need parenting than there are a supply of parents to care for them, and to cut off some of the people willing to provide loving homes for them is really just a tragic development. And you know, and it's a circumstance, you know, when we talk about the Masterpiece Cake case, a lot of people say, well, you know, there's a lot of other cake shops, and that's not really a good answer, but there is at least some truth to that, you know, that Charlie and David were able to find a cake elsewhere. But in a lot of areas, particularly less populated areas, religious providers of charitable services, including things like adoption and foster care, are maybe the only provider in the area. And you know, they've gotten that huge charitable footprint partly because they are doing good work, and they've, you know, made that a mission for you know, their religious institution. But it means there really aren't even other options. And just, you know, one other area to be aware of, and there's a lot of things like this coming out of the Trump, and maybe this is a place to say the Trump-Pence administration, such as a regulation that allows healthcare providers to discriminate or to not provide services if they say it violates their religion. And that could be not just your doctor or, you know, a hospital making a, you know, a broad decision for the entire organization, but it could be that the person who you know, that you check in with decides they're going to turn you away because of the condition you have or because you're transgender. It could be the nurse who in a, you know, a very emergent situation is going to refuse to provide care. So that and so, you know, the federal administration, which, you know, previously was largely an ally in these issues, is now pushing in the same direction as some of these private organizations.
I'll share a personal story. We talk about, is it just about cake? Is, you know, when we have these kinds of decisions come down from the Supreme Court, there's, you know, there's this tone that affects the dialogue of our community and of our country. You know, recently my partner and I got married after being together 22 years. And part of our decision making is like we're older, you know, and we both need health insurance, and she works for a Catholic hospital. And so, and she, you know, has been there for 30, 40 years. And right now, her where she works recognizes our marriage. And so we were having this, well, we should probably get married right now, because with this religious exception strategy out there in the wind, I can see something. Well, if you work for this kind of institution and they don't support same-sex, maybe they don't have to provide coverage for the same-sex spouse. So that's the danger when we start making these exceptions and these differences, because then then all of us are subject to being part citizens or part humans. And so does it affect is it just about case? No. It impacts, and it has the potential to impact every aspect of our life.
How do you think this ruling is going to impact the 2019 legislative session, which we anxiously await, which starts in January 2019?
I'm going back to Maryland, so.
I'll start and then anybody can jump in. But I mean, for those of you that were involved, and I hope all of you were involved during the 2017 session, saw what happened. There was, I believe, 28 anti-LGBT bills that were out there that would ultimately impact our community, impact our families, impact us personally. And most of it, I will say, that was targeted against the trans community. While there was only one that was signed in, which was a foster care adoption, HB 3859, I believe, and we were able to fight back a lot of them, which is great, because again, going back to people making their voices heard, advocating, and going to Austin and going to their local offices for their elected officials. Is it going away for 2019? Unfortunately not. In fact, it's probably going to be worse. Not only with our current administration, but with things that happen with like Masterpiece, where it's emboldening people far more than it ever has before. For them to go out there and to think that it is okay to actively discriminate against our community it's out there and it's real. So I can't stress enough the fact that it's going to be hell. But if we team up together, if we as communities band together and make our voices heard, take direct action, not just having sidebar conversations with our friends, but actually action that is going to make impacts within our communities, I think that we can also fight back just like we did in 2017. But is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. Is it going to be hard work? Absolutely. But yeah, it's going to be tough, and it's going to be there, and we're going to hear it a lot more than we did in 2017. The misinformation that'll be out there is going to be even greater, and so it's going to take an army of not only LGBTQ identified folks, but also our allies, to stand up, squash the misinformation that's out there, put information out there that is correct, and really truly let people know who LGBTQ people are. More importantly, who trans people are as well. It's who we work with. It's who we go to church with. It's people in our schools. We are their neighbors, and so we have to make sure that people are aware of that, because again, it's going to be brutal in 2019.
And I think we're going to see a lot more religious refusals. I mean, the 28 bills that you're talking about were kind of, the bathroom bill took up so much energy that some of these religious refusal ones went unnoticed, but they have proposals to amend the Texas Constitution. They have proposals to add religious exemptions in so many professions and aspects of life. And I think Robert's right that it's a fight for allies. It's not a fight for one community, because those religious refusals, once they're on the books, apply to everybody. It's not, even though they may single out LGBTQ people for their arguments at the legislature, once it's the law, they can use them against anyone.
So let's talk a little bit about what's happening at the Supreme Court, and what does the retirement of Justice Kennedy mean for equality and for the movement for equality?
Well, I think people